Colorado had enough of the Pac-12's wishy-washiness and is now headed back to the Big 12, a massive domino to fall in the conference realignment game, and one that could have serious ramifications for Gonzaga.
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hey folks, welcome into the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Happy Friday, Zag Nation. We got conference realignment talk today, pretty much all show long. We're going to talk about Gonzaga. We're going to talk about the Big 12. We're going to talk about the Pac-12, Colorado's departure from the Pac-12 to the Big 12, of course, what that means going down the line. We also have an update on Gonzaga's only known recruiting target, Jeremiah Williams, who has committed to Rutgers. What does that mean for Gonzaga in the transfer portal? We'll close out the show about that, but we got to start with the biggest story going around in college athletics right now. Colorado, after hiring Deion Sanders, after a horrendous season on the gridiron for football last year, they hire Deion Sanders. They bring him in, overhaul the entire roster. And now it kind of looks like Deion Sanders and the staff over there kind of did the Pac-12 dirty in the sense that this might be it for the Conference of Champions. Of course, you can't blame Colorado for the years-long ineptitude that we have seen from George Kliavkoff and the Pac-12 Conference, their inability to get a media rights deal done and announced their inability to add San Diego State before there was an exit fee associated with the school. Put this conference in a really tough position. They wanted to stay together. They've wanted to stay together ever since USC and UCLA made their announcement in June of 2022, about 14 months ago now, that they were going to leave for the Big Ten. The Pac-12 has said we are 10 strong. We're going to hold them all together. And 14 months later, no media rights deal, no new additions, nothing like that. The Big 12 went to Colorado and said, hey, you got until August 1st to let us know if you want to join the Big 12, come back to the Big 12, I should say, or not. Last week, when the Pac-12 had their media rights day and media day and didn't make any announcements regarding a media rights deal, Colorado had seen enough. They're out the door. And now the big question is, what does this mean right now? Because as I'm recording this on Friday morning, and I waited to record a little bit later in the morning in case there was some breaking news that came out in the morning. We haven't seen it yet. Hopefully, I've had some bad luck in the past on this podcast, so hopefully there won't be some breaking news shortly after this is released, but we're going to kind of look through what some of the next steps might be, because the Big 12 they haven't hidden what their next steps potentially are going to be. In an era where, getting information and disinformation is difficult, and there's certainly been a lot of disinformation flying around with the Pac-12 and the Big 12 up to this point, but Brett Yormark, the commissioner of the Big 12, has made it clear he is continuing to look to expand and grow this conference. He wants to build a coast-to-coast conference. He wants to build a conference that is dominant on the basketball court. And he wants to continue to improve the brand awareness and recognition for the Big 12 Conference. Adding Colorado puts them at 13 schools. They, of course, already added Houston and Central Florida and BYU and Cincinnati. They're losing Texas and Oklahoma. Now they add Colorado. That brings them up to 13 starting in 2024. Probably not going to stay at 13. Probably not going to be at 13 at any point. Before the 2024 season, they will add at least a 14th member, potentially 3 more members to get them to 16. This is the expectation for what the Big 12 is going to do. And most of the conversations since Colorado's announcement regarding the Big 12's expansion hasn't included Gonzaga, which I think is telling of where Gonzaga is at in the pecking order right now for Big 12 and conference realignment. The Big 12's priority is continuing to poach from the Pac-12, and it probably should be. Hard to argue with the logic there. If you think you can pull on a thread and it's going to unravel the whole thing, you got to see it through. You got to continue to explore this. Their number one target right now is Arizona. Arizona, of course, fulfills their desire to continue to expand westward while also bringing in basketball powerhouses. It's a very obvious fit based on what Brett Yormark wants to do in his conference. Adding Tommy Lloyd and the Wildcats to a Big 12 that has Baylor and Houston and Kansas would be a tremendous, tremendous boost to an already incredibly stellar basketball conference. Ideally, for Yormark and the Big 12, they can get all the corner schools: Arizona, Arizona State, and Utah. Those three joining Colorado gives the Big 12 a round, solid number of 16 schools. It expands them out westward. It improves their media footprint, and it improves them from a basketball perspective to an extent. Utah, Colorado, and Arizona State, frankly, don't move the needle a ton for the Big 12 basketball. I think Colorado is going to be a sneaky good team. Arizona State did make the NCAA tournament last year. Utah is growing under Coach Craig Smith, but more of a football move than a basketball move in terms of adding Utah and even sort of Arizona State. They're kind of in the middle right now, but still a productive move for the conference if they're able to do that. Of course, really decimated the Pac-12. That would decimate the Pac-12. We'll talk about what that would mean in the second segment. But if if the Big 12 cannot add Arizona, Arizona State, Utah, they may try to get Oregon, Washington, and Utah. Oregon and Washington have also been vetted and approved by the Big Ten, although the Big Ten is not making any indication they're trying to expand right now. But it's possible Oregon and Washington would hold out for a Big Ten invitation rather than jumping to the Big 12. That remains to be seen. But if the Big 12 is unable to land any more Pac-12 schools, which at this point would be a little surprising. The Pac-12 is down to 9. That is an extremely precarious position to be in. But if they cannot pull any more, if Arizona stays, if Oregon and Washington stay, then I think the Big 12 starts looking other directions to potentially fill out that 14th spot to fill the conference in 2024. And according to multiple reports, Action Network, Brett McMurphy had a lot of stuff on this. I've seen it a handful of places. The list of schools that the Big 12 would choose from to add as a partner with Colorado is fairly lengthy and doesn't include Gonzaga from the list that we have seen. UConn is the number one school that continues to get mentioned. UConn and Colorado are obviously not travel partners. They're nowhere close to each other geographically. Colorado and BYU would be the more logical travel partner in that sense. But again, Yormark's decision or quest to expand as far out coast to coast as he possibly can while building a basketball brand, UConn is a pretty obvious candidate, as Gonzaga would be as well in terms of doing that. You go all the way to Storrs, Connecticut, far east, to add a program like UConn. They just won the national championship. They've won 5 in the last 25 years. They also have a football program, which makes adding them from a financial perspective, what kind of cut are they going to get out of the deal, all that stuff, it makes it a lot simpler if you're adding a program that already has a football team. Not a very good football team for UConn, mind you, but also passable. It's fine to add a program that's going to maybe dilute your football product a little bit while adding a tremendous boost to your basketball product. I think Yormark is going to consider that worth it. Memphis has been mentioned here as well, and so has UNLV and San Diego State. Out of the Mountain West, of course, there's a exit fee associated with adding San Diego State or UNLV right now, so that could be a sticking point for the Big 12, whether they'd be willing to wait on that or not. The Big 12 has also been rumored to be interested in both Syracuse and St. John's, although those are probably below Gonzaga on the pecking order, would be my read on that situation. But regardless, it sounds like the Big 12 has alternative options to pursue before they would consider adding Gonzaga, which makes Gonzaga as the 14th member of the Big 12 conference in 2024 a pipe dream, something that is pretty unlikely to actually come together. Does that mean Gonzaga to the Big 12 is dead? No, it probably means that it's not happening in this go round, but that seemed likely a while ago. There was some momentum March, April, so a lot of conversation around the Big 12. But now with it kind of tapering off a little bit, with UConn getting more involved in the picture, and now with the Big 12 actually successfully being able to poach schools from the Pac-12, which could potentially continue to happen, which I think is probably the most likely outcome here, is that the Big 12 takes a few more schools from the Pac-12, calls it good at 16, and then you're kind of left with a small, not viable Pac-12 conference being kind of the main representative on the West Coast for premier Power 5, Power 6 conferences. If that were to happen, what does that mean? Because the Pac-12 is already and would certainly be in a very desperate situation. Could that lead to them coming after Gonzaga as a basketball-only member? And Would that even be something Gonzaga would be interested in? We're going to talk more about that after a word from today's sponsor, LinkedIn Jobs. These days, every new potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business. You want to be 100% certain that you have access to the best qualified candidates available, and that's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs, because LinkedIn Jobs helps find the right people for your team faster and for free. It's so easy to create a free job post, and then you just add your job to the purple hashtag hiring frame all around your LinkedIn profile to spread the word that you're hiring. Plus, simple tools like screening questions make it easy to focus on candidates with just the right skills and experience so that you can quickly prioritize who you'd like to interview and ultimately hire. And let's be honest, the right team member can have a positive and measurable impact on your business. This is why small businesses rate LinkedIn Jobs #1 in delivering quality hires versus leading competitors. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. That is linkedin.com/lockedoncollege to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. All right, folks, I want to thank all of you for making Locked On Zags your first listen or your first watch of the day. Happy Friday once again. We got some fantastic stuff coming your way next week. We'll continue to talk about the transfer portal, if there are more players for Gonzaga to pursue with those 2 open roster spots. We'll continue to look at conference realignment. This story is nowhere close to being over. What does it mean for Gonzaga? What does it mean around the college sports landscape? We'll keep you posted on that as well, including right now a conversation about what's next for Gonzaga. What if it's not the Big 12? Because right now it's kind of leaning like it's not going to be the Big 12, at least not right away. And I think a key part of this that we can talk about here is that Gonzaga is not in a hurry to leave the WCC. And I know that there is a segment of the fan base who is very ready for Gonzaga to leave the WCC. And certainly I think that there's no debate or conversation about, well, Big 12 or WCC, what's better? Like, things need to line up for it to work out financially. There needs to be some things to be ironed out in order for it to work. But the Big 12 is a better basketball conference for Gonzaga than the WCC. There's just no debate about that. It is. And I'm a huge champion of the WCC, have been that throughout my time here on Locked On Zags. But if the Zags could get in the Big 12 or the Big East or some other conferences like that that are top to bottom just better than the WCC, I think they should do that. But I don't think they need to make the first move that's available to them. And in fact, they chose not to do that. When presented with an opportunity to join the Mountain West Conference 5 years ago, they didn't take that opportunity. That's probably for the best, because right now it looks like the Mountain West is possibly going to get gutted. And if they were to lose San Diego State, or if they were to lose UNLV or some of those other brands, that would put Gonzaga in a relatively tough spot. So their decision to be patient paid off last time. And right now, I think that's kind of the continued course of action for Gonzaga. Let's take a look at what might happen in the Pac-12, though. The Pac-12 right now is at 9 schools. If somehow George Kliavkoff, the commissioner of the Pac-12, is able to convince those other 9 member schools to stand pat, they would be able to add what they can't add San Diego State or anybody out of the Mountain West at this point without having that school having to pay a $30-something million exit fee, which is just not going to happen. So what the Pac-12 could do is they could turn towards another long-time target in SMU, Southern Methodist down in Dallas, Texas. They could add SMU, who doesn't have to face that kind of exit fee. SMU becomes the 10th member. You play it out for a year at the Pac-10. Then after that, you look to add San Diego State, you look to add UNLV, you look to add whomever else you want to add to get up to 12. This is probably the best case scenario for the viability of the Pac-12 conference. It's hard to say that it's a likely scenario. It feels like, again, the thread has been pulled, and that might be the end for the Pac-12, or at least the Pac-12 as we know it right now. It's already kind of fallen apart without USC, UCLA, and now Colorado. But if they were to add SMU, if they were to turn around and add 2 more schools the following year, if San Diego State was still available, which, who knows if the Big 12 or somebody else is going to come calling, I think they'd go in that direction. Could Gonzaga be in the mix there? My gut says probably not. The Pac-12 has historically been reticent to add schools who don't fit their big research institution belief system, mentality, etc. As my good friend, the host of the Locked On Pac-12 podcast, Spencer McLaughlin, likes to say on his podcast, he said this is going to be on his gravestone, President's vote on conference realignment. And I think that that's a really important note to make here, because that's who's making the decisions, the school presidents. Gonzaga's athletic director, Chris Standiford, does not make the final decision on whether Gonzaga joins a new conference. Mark Few does not make the final decision on whether Gonzaga joins another conference. Gonzaga president Thane McCullough makes that decision. Same with all the presidents in the Pac-12, all the presidents in the Big 12. They are the people who vote on this. So it is possible that Gonzaga, as a non-football school, would still not get the invite, even for a desperate Pac-12. It's also possible that Gonzaga would look at a gutted Pac-12. If we're assuming that Arizona and Arizona State stay, I think that helps a lot. If Arizona stays, if the only school that they lose is Colorado, they add SMU, they add San Diego State, they offer Gonzaga that final spot. Now you're adding a conference that has Arizona, that has San Diego State, that has Oregon and Washington, that has Washington State, a regional rivalry there. Stanford and Cal, who have not been historically great basketball programs. Utah, not a historically great basketball program, but at least Power 5 conference caliber programs. I think Gonzaga would consider this if they were given the invitation, if it was a full membership with baseball, with all the rest of their sports as well. I don't necessarily see this as being something particularly likely to happen. And I think even for Gonzaga, if you feel like you'd have to be really confident that the Pac-12 isn't going to continue to just fall apart. Why would Gonzaga jump out of the WCC to join what would be a better Pac-12? If we're talking about a situation where Pac-12 has San Diego State, Arizona, Oregon, all those schools, it's better than the WCC. But if you jump there and then, it could be a month later that Oregon and Washington are going to go to the Big Ten, and all of a sudden you're like kind of in a precarious position. So to me, I'm not sure Gonzaga makes that jump. I think Gonzaga is willing to be picky enough that if the Big 12 doesn't want them this time around, fine, we'll just wait it out. Maybe the Big 12 will want us next time. Maybe they'll go up to 18. Maybe somebody else will get poached out of the Big 12 and they'll drop back down and we'll be on the radar again. There are other alternatives too. Of course, there's the Mountain West. I don't see any reason why Gonzaga would join the Mountain West at this point, because they didn't join them 5 years ago when there was no real rumors about San Diego State or any other schools leaving. Joining the Mountain West now when San Diego State might jump ship seems kind of pointless. It's not better than the WCC, especially not without San Diego State. So I just don't really see that as a reasonable option or a logical option for Gonzaga to do. And then there's the Big East. And the only reason I bring up the Big East is because it's possible that UConn is leaving the Big East to join the Big 12. It's not super likely necessarily. I'm still of the belief that the most likely outcome here is Arizona, Arizona State, Utah join the Big 12. The Pac-12 is down to 6. I'm not exactly sure what's going to happen after that. Perhaps the Oregon and Washington do go to the Big 10, and then you're left with Oregon State, Washington State, Stanford, and Cal. Those 4 schools maybe merge with the Mountain West. Like there's going to be some kind of wonkiness that might happen within that realm. And we can have a conversation about whether that could involve Gonzaga in the future, because frankly, I think that it's possible that something in that realm happens and you kind of forge a new like Pac West conference of sorts. But I think if things didn't work out for those corner schools going from the Pac-12 to the Big 12, and the Big 12 pivoted and added UConn, the Big East would be down to 10. And it's possible the Big East would look to make 2 additions to get up to 12. Could that be Gonzaga and St. Mary's? Hard to say. St. Mary's is an interesting school from a conference realignment perspective because they are a non-accredited school. They are very, very small. It might be difficult for them to financially afford traveling to the Big East from St. Mary's, from Moraga, California. There's some complications that would come with that. But from a basketball brand perspective, if the Big East wanted to expand west and they could add Gonzaga and St. Mary's, 2 of the premier non-football basketball brands in America, especially on the West Coast, that'd be a huge win for the Big East. What if the Big East wants Gonzaga and they add Dayton or St. Louis out of the A10, some very top tier basketball programs that don't have football as well? Leaves Gonzaga without an obvious travel partner. There's some complications that could come out of that, but it's something to consider. The Big East makes sense as a fit for Gonzaga in terms of just what the conference is, a premier basketball conference that doesn't have football or doesn't care about football. It makes sense. But the geography is a really tough hurdle to overcome. It's easier to overcome in the Big 12 because there's a lot more money getting thrown around. In the Big East, it would be more challenging. It's also more travel. It's farther away than the Big 12 is. Most of the schools in the Big East are way the heck out there. They're in Washington, D.C. They're in Cincinnati. Like, they are way the heck out on the east side of the state, of the country. It'd be difficult for Gonzaga to make that work, but it's possible. It is another alternative that could be pursued down the line for Gonzaga should the chips fall in a way where UConn is leaving the Big 12 or leaving the Big East, and the Big East is looking to expand to help fill that gap. Well, we're pivoting away from conference realignment conversations to talk about Gonzaga's only known target on the transfer portal trail as of right now, Jeremiah Williams. He's no longer available. He has committed to Rutgers. What does it mean for Gonzaga's quest to add another guard to this roster? We're going to tell you after a word from today's sponsor, eBay Motors. For a championship team, it is all about making sure every player is a perfect fit. And it's the same when it comes to your favorite vehicle. Every part needs to fit just right. So the next time you need parts and accessories, head to eBay Motors. With eBay's guaranteed fit, you can be sure every part you need fits right the first time around. Just add your ride to My Garage and look for the green check to know the part will fit, or you get your money back. Because just like in sports, confidence is the name of the game when you shop on eBay Motors. And with over 122 million parts to choose from, you'll be back in the game in no time. After all, it's easy to bring home a win when the right parts are guaranteed. Get the right parts, the right fit, and the right prices on ebaymotors.com. eBay's guaranteed fit is only available to U.S. customers, eligible items only, and exclusions do apply. All right, folks, segment 3, still any patents, still locked on Zags. Switching away from conference realignment, which will be a big talking point going forward into the month of August as we continue to see what's happening with the Big 12, the Pac-12, and everything else going on in the realignment game. But we are closing out today's show and the week talking about Jeremiah Williams. Jeremiah Williams has been a target for Gonzaga for the last couple of weeks. One of many guards the Zags reached out to in the transfer portal after learning of Malachi Smith's departure. They pursued Paul Mulcahy, who went from Rutgers to the University of Washington. They pursued Joe Toussaint, who went from West Virginia to Texas Tech. They've pursued Jose Perez, who ended up staying at West Virginia. They've been pretty active on this market, trying to find a third or fourth guard to play in the backcourt. They have Ryan Nembhard at the starting one position. They have Nolan Hickman, who I expect to play more of an off-ball role next season. They have Dusty Stromer, incoming freshman. They have Steele Venters, who would kind of project to play the 3, but it's possible he plays more at the 2, especially if either June Sok-Yo or Marcus Adams Jr. are more prepared to play big minutes at the 3. So Gonzaga could be relatively set with Venters, Nembhard, Hickman, and Stromer, but they have been pretty active trying to find another guard to add into that mix, which makes me think they're probably more willing to play Venters at the 3 and or limit Stromer's minutes in year 1. But here's the deal. They're running out of targets. And what we know about Mark Few and the staff is that they're picky. They're not going to add a player just to add a player. They're not going to add a player specifically because he's the best player currently available. If that player doesn't fit, if that player isn't who Mark Few is looking for to fill a specific role, he's not going to add him. And right now, I don't know if there is a player out there who is available. Jeremiah Williams was a target for Gonzaga. They reached out to him after he decommitted from Iowa. He had spent last year at Iowa State, but he did not play for the Cyclones. He was out with a foot injury. The last time he did play was with Temple. He spent 2 years at Temple, averaged about 9.5 points, 4.5 assists, 1.3 steals. Very good defensive player, 6'5" guard, really kind of fit what it felt like Gonzaga was looking for. They wanted a bigger guard. They wanted a defensive focused guard. And it made sense based on what they needed. Hickman and Nembhard are both relatively small. Stromer is 6'6", but he's very skinny and he's a true freshman. True freshmen tend to not come in and play elite defense right away. That's usually an acquired skill. So for Gonzaga, a bigger, hard-nosed defensive guard totally is an area that is lacking on this roster. It made the pursuit of many of those players make a lot of sense. Jeremiah Williams was an option for that role, but he goes to Rutgers. Makes sense there. Paul Mulcahy, who was also a Gonzaga target, transferred out of Rutgers to go to University of Washington. Cam Spencer, who was their starting guard and one of their best player last year, he transfers to UConn. So Rutgers pretty desperate for some guard help. They go out and get Jeremiah Williams. Nice addition for them. He's certainly going to have a bigger role at Rutgers than he would have at Gonzaga. But what it does now is it leaves Gonzaga in a spot where there's not really a lot of good options still available on the transfer portal. Now, that could change. Grad transfers are eligible to enter the transfer portal at any time and could continue to do so. Every day that we get closer to September, when school starts and we get closer to practices and we get closer to the actual season, is less and less likely that more players are going to jump ship. We saw a lot of surprising late additions to the transfer portal, but I don't think we're going to see a whole lot more. Doesn't mean we won't see any more. It only takes one. If one player that Gonzaga feels is a fit for them joins the transfer portal, they can go get them, and it could work out perfectly. Marcus Adams Jr. came out of absolutely nowhere and is now going to be a Zag for the next couple of years, which is fantastic. But in terms of looking at this specific type of player that Gonzaga has been pursuing into Saint and Mulcahy and Jose Perez and everybody else, the options are pretty limited. There are a few that we have talked about on this podcast. As of my understanding of who Gonzaga has contacted in the transfer portal, there are not any players available that Gonzaga has reached out to. That is probably not true in the sense that Gonzaga is probably working the phones and has contacted some players and made some connections, but nothing public that I have seen indicates that Gonzaga is connected to any currently available players in the NCAA transfer portal. A few players who are available who could be targets for Gonzaga based on what we perceive them as pursuing right now. DeMar Langford, I talked about him on a recent episode. I think it was the week before last. Boston College, 4-star kid, never really quite reached the high expectations that he had at Boston College, but still a very talented young man, being pursued mostly by New Mexico State and Central Florida, but could be a third, fourth guard option for Gonzaga. Jalen Carey out of Rhode Island, talked about him a few times on the podcast as well. Started his career at Syracuse, was a top 100 prospect, ended up going to Rhode Island, put up decent, not elite, but decent numbers at Rhode Island. I think he's only 6'3", so he's not quite the big guard range that I think Gonzaga fans were hoping for, but certainly somebody who could fill a fourth guard role for Gonzaga quite easily. Noah Williams began his college basketball career at Washington State, is from the state of Washington, then transferred to Washington. So he has played at the two state schools in the state of Washington. Could he come to Gonzaga to kind of continue the trend of playing at colleges in the same state? Big scoring guard, 6'5", average 14 per game at Washington State. Didn't play quite as well at UW last year, but there was some injuries and just kind of a logjam for minutes for Mike Hopkins' team. But Noah Williams strikes me as a guy. I don't think he's a great defensive player, but a guy who could come in and help be a microwave scorer off the bench, and certainly could lean into a defensive role if given that assignment for Gonzaga. So none of these guys are as good as Jose Perez, who would have been the perfect target had he chose not to stay at Washington State, or at Washington State, at West Virginia. None of these guys are as good as Malachi Smith, but there are options should Gonzaga feel that these players are a good enough fit in the program, team culture-wise, all of that stuff, to bring them in and have them fill a role. But again, Gonzaga is picky. And if they decide that, hey, I think we're just better off with Dusty Stromer, we're better off with Yo playing more minutes, or Adams Jr. playing more minutes, or whatever, we're just going to roll with that. I think that's great. I don't see any problem with that. I think it's very realistic that Gonzaga is done adding to their roster, that Marcus Adams Jr. is the final piece to this roster heading into next season. They'll keep those 2 scholarship spots open. Perhaps they'll give one to one of the walk-ons, but I think they might just keep it where it is right now and go into the season with what they got. And that might be totally okay with where we're at, because there's not a lot of great talent left in the portal. And if Mark Few doesn't feel like the guys out there are going to be enough of a positive on the roster, then he's just not going to go after them. Nothing wrong with that. All right, that's going to wrap us up for today and for the week here on the Locked On Zags podcast. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to make this show your first listen or your first watch of the day. Make sure you leave a review on iTunes, follow on Twitter, hit that subscribe button on YouTube, all of that great stuff. We'll be back next week with more realignment and transfer portal talk right here on Locked On Zags. Thank you all for listening. And of course, as always, go Zags.